Hello, welcome to my workshop here in Hertfordshire. As you can see, I'm busy knitting another garment on the Model 96 Simpleframe, and I'm wearing one which has come off this frame, and I'm surrounded by others. I'm sitting watching the television as I knit, so if you'll excuse me, I will just turn the television set off, and then we can deal with the operation of the frame. I'm going to show you how to assemble the frame and knit with it, and I'll be following the sequence in the handbook which has been supplied with your frame. You may find it useful to have that by you.
Let's start at the very beginning. This is what most of you will find in your box when you first open it. Take the bag containing the mixed components and empty it out. You'll need most of these during the assembly. Take the wooden frame, remove the rubber bands from the upper needle rails, and then replace the rails. There is a right and a wrong way of putting them in. When you put them in the right way, you'll find that the little ledge on the upper rail corresponds to a similar ledge on the lower rail. The top edge here is pointed. Select the inner and outer yarn guides and the knurled nut and screw and place in position. The inner yarn guide has a little crescent. And repeat for the other end. Select a bag of spacers and position them one by one by laying them on the frame and then twisting them so that the lugs catch under the rails. Lay on and twist. Lay on and twist. This is a Model 96. So I'm going to put 49 spacers on this side. There are the 49 spacers in position on one needle bed. Now I turn the frame round and place 49 spacers on the other side. Now position the stitch size bar along the bottom here. Select 2 wing nuts and 2 screws. These screws are the ones with the slot across the head. Note that the stitch size bar also has a little ledge on one side, and this is placed initially towards the spacers. Here you can see the wing nut and the slot in the screw. Do the same on the other side. Select the needles and place the first one in position between the spacers and close them together. Do the same all along the needle bed. The little pin on the side of the spacer locates in a hole on the side of the next spacer and holds the needle in. Now select the clamp plates and plastic caps. Slide the caps onto each end of the plates. The caps stop the clamp plates from sliding on the wooden frame. Take a right hand and left hand needle clamp. The right hand clamp has a slot. You also need 2 more of the wing nuts and slotted screws. Take the right hand slotted clamp, and position. Put the screw in from the front and then the clamp plate goes underneath. Finally, the wing nut holds the assembly together. Lightly tighten until the clamp does not slide. Never over tighten. And now repeat with the left hand clamp. Now you can turn to the other needle bed. Once again, position the needles between the spacers. 48 needles, 49 spacers on each side. Select the clamp assembly again. The slot in the clamp is to protect the little pin on the side of the spacer. Slacken off the wing nuts so that the needle beds can be moved, and position them opposite one another so that the needle on the outside is the left-hand needle on the needle bed nearest to you. The needle opposite comes up between the two needles. When adjusted, lightly tighten the wing nuts so that the clamps do not slide. To stick the little caps on the needles, I use Boss Stick number 1 clear adhesive. Dab a little glue on each needle, then leave it to set for 5 minutes before putting the butt caps on. I set mine up in patterns of 6. The first needle one colour, then 5 another colour. You will see that you can easily identify the pairs of needles, important when you come to do fair isle work. Take the cast-on lace and use a needle and thread to pull the lace through the holes in the take-down roller. First this end, and then the other. Finally, adjust the ease of movement of the needles. They should slide up and down easily. If they are tight, loosen and slide the clamp out. If they are loose and will not stay up, loosen and slide the clamp towards the needles. Lightly tighten the nuts when you have finished. I have found it very worthwhile to use a spray polish containing silicone and spray the needle beds. This one is a furniture polish containing silicone sold by a well-known supermarket. Leave it a little while and then wipe off the surplus with a tissue. When you have finished, you'll find some components left over. These are spare needles and needle spacers. The stitch size guide and cast-on bar we will explain later. These components form the stocking stitch attachment. I recommend you do not use it for your first garments. However, I will just show you how to assemble it, but then leave it to one side. Thread the stocking stitch fingers onto the bar. This is the model 96, so it will have 49 of these fingers. The handbook tells you the number to put on other sizes. There you are. Now let's put it to one side. Well, that didn't take long, did it? In fact, the assembly really is quite straightforward and quick. Now I'm going to show you how to use the frame. I'm sure you're eager to get on and start knitting. I'm going to use the handbook and we're going to do cast on. So let's go. Raise all the needles. Note where I'm putting my thumb and how I'm bending my fingers and squeezing the needles up. Tap the frame each side to open the latches. Check that the latches are open by running your thumbs along the hooks. Tie a slip knot in the yarn and lay over the first needle and pull the knot down to about stitch size. Lay the yarn across the needles and through the yarn guides at the other end. Partially lower each needle to form a zigzag. My zigzag is just the width of the gap between the needle rails. If you take the needles right down, you'll get a loopy cast on. If you watch carefully, you will see that I'm using my forefingers as a guide to lowering the needles. Turn the frame round and raise the needles using the back of the stitch size guide to push the loops down over the latches. Feed the yarn into the hook of each needle and make a stitch by lowering the needle. Do the same with each needle in turn. Pull the knot over the latch on the end needle and turn the frame round and repeat on the other side, raising all the needles, once again pushing down with the stitch size guide and then feeding in the yarn. Don't hold the yarn too tight as you feed it in. If you do, you make only a little stitch. A small stitch gives a tighter cast on edge. To get a larger stitch size, lower the stitch size bar so that you can take the needles further down the needle bed and pull more yarn into the stitch. That will give a more elastic cast on edge. There's your cast on. Now feed the cast on lace through the gap between the upper needle rails. A little tip, turn the roller so that the holes point up. Then if you need to adjust the lace loops, they will slide easily. Take the cast on bar and feed it through the loops. Make sure the lengths of the loops are the same, pulling a little through if necessary. Then when I wind the roller, the bar will rest gently all along the knitting. Adjusting the stitch size. Raise all the needles, any order, several at a time. Make sure they go right up. Take the yarn out of the yarn guides and lay it across the needles and through the yarn guides at the other end. Hold the frame in your knees. This frees both hands. Loosen off the stitch size bar. Take the stitch size gauge which has a pointed edge to fit under the butt caps. Catch the yarn in one of the needles somewhere in the middle. Now the stitch size is a matter of how much yarn you pull into the stitch. That in turn depends on how far down the needle bed you take the needle. To get a stitch size like that, raise the stitch size bar until it touches the heel of the needle and stops the needle going down further. Use the stitch size gauge to give the required size. Lower the needle down the slot marked with the appropriate stitch size, pushing the gauge up against the backs of the needles in the upper position. That finger then holds the gauge in position at the same time as positioned to keep the needle at the bottom of the slot. Now raise the stitch size bar gently until it touches the heel of the needle. Swing it until it is parallel to the bottom so that all the needles can be lowered the same amount. Then gently tighten the nuts. Some people make a series of marks on the frame and one on the bar to help them line up the stitch size. Slide the gauge out and pull the needle up with the yarn to drop the original stitch back onto the needle. Turn the frame round and repeat on the other side. Before knitting, just check that all the latches are open by feeling along the hooks. They have an uncanny knack of closing when you adjust the stitch size. Now, knitting. Lower the first nearest needle to you, then lower the first needle on the other side, and continue alternately down the needle beds. Note that I'm taking each needle right down to the stitch size bar and holding it there whilst I lower the one on the other side. If you don't do that, when you lower the next needle, the last one will pull up slightly and give a smaller stitch. I found it best to use my finger resting gently on the side of the needle to hold it down. Doing it that way, I can get a good speed and I need not watch the knitting as I go along. Give a twist on the roller. It need not click, and that pulls the stitches in so that you do not unpick the stitches when you raise the needles. Don't over tighten the roller. Turn the frame round and raise all the needles. You can do it in any order, both sides at the same time or one side first, as many needles as you like. Take the yarn out of the yarn guides and lay it across the needles again and through the yarn guides at the other end. When you lower the first needle, make sure the yarn is above the latch, otherwise you will drop the stitch or split the yarn. Continue lowering the needles on both sides as before, making sure they go right down to the stitch size bar and stay there. This is full needle rib. The knitted fabric pulls down and will eventually roll up underneath on the roller. If the yarn jumps around as you knit, leading to drop stitches, increase the yarn tension by rotating the yarn guide. The roller winds up one way, and to release it to unwind, just take the load on the roller and release the roller catch, holding it until you have finished unwinding the roller. Sometimes when you are knitting and you raise the needle, some will slide down. Just run your thumb and finger along the needle spaces towards the sliding needle. Now, yarns. The Simpleframe knits a wide range of yarns which can be coned or in balls. I usually take the yarn from the center of the ball so that it does not roll around whilst I'm knitting. There is a chart in the handbook which gives the stitch size you should try for different stitches and yarns. The chart relates these stitch sizes to the hand knitting needle sizes recommended for the yarns. Shaping. You can shape by increasing and decreasing the number of stitches. This piece has fully fashioned shaping. The basic decrease method is to lift the stitch off the end needle and transfer it to the adjacent needle. Do the same on the other side. Then when you knit next time, the two stitches on the needle will knit into one stitch. Knit two together as in hand knitting. Fully fashioned shaping gives a nicer edge to the fabric. Transfer a stitch 2 or 3 stitches away from the edge, then move the adjoining stitches over onto the empty needles. Do the same on the other bed. And here we knit across, decreasing 2 stitches at one end and 2 at the other. Increasing the number of stitches is rather like hand knitting, where you knit twice into the same stitch. Here I'm making a fully fashioned increase, lifting 2 stitches sideways. Then I turn the needle round and pick up the stitch below, dropping it onto the empty needle. Repeat the process on the other side. Turn the needle and drop the stitch below onto the empty needle. Cast off. Using a spare latch needle, start at the end away from the ball of yarn. Raise the needle, hook the loose latch needle into the hook of the needle and lower it to drop the stitch onto the spare needle. Keep the needles in line to help the stitch drop off. Push the loose needle through the stitch so that it drops over the latch onto the stem. Turn the loose needle, raise the needle on the other side, hook the loose needle into the hook, and again lower the needle to drop the stitch into the loose hook. Now you'll see you have 1 stitch in the hook and 1 on the stem. Pull the needle and the stitches knit together. Push the needle back to drop the stitch onto the stem, turn the needle around and do the same again on the other side. Let's have a look at the same operation from another angle. With practice you will develop quite a speed. There are many ways of casting off, and no doubt you will soon find your favourite. This is mine. When eventually you get to the last stitch, pick up the yarn and knit a stitch with the yarn, then cut the yarn and pull the loose end through the stitch. That locks the last stitch. Here you can see I'm developing quite a speed. Another method of cast off favoured by some machine knitters is to knit a stitch, then lift the stitch onto the needle in the opposite bed, knit a stitch, then transfer the new stitch over onto the next needle in the first bed. So you knit the old stitch and a new stitch together into 1 stitch and then transfer over. Now let us have a look at some double bed stitch variations. First of all, fisherman's rib. Instead of lowering the needles completely on both sides when you knit, partially lower the first needle until you feel it starting to pull through the stitch, then stop. Lower the needle in the other bed completely. Continue partially lowering the needles in one bed and completely lowering them in the other. You can see the needles on one side partially lowered and on the other completely lowered. In machine knitting terminology, this is called tucking on the double bed. In hand knitting terminology, what I've done is this. On these needles you can see the stitches from the row below on the stems. The row I have just knitted is in the hooks on both sides. When I raise the needles, the row I've just knitted drops onto the stem to knit next time. When I raise the needles on the other side, the row I've just knitted drops onto the stem and joins the row below. So when I knit next time, it will be the equivalent of knit 1, purl 1, knit into the row below. You'll find it easier to raise all the needles with one stitch first, then raise the other needles. Repeat, partially lowering the needles with the same hand. Because I turned the frame round, I am in fact partially lowering the needles on the opposite side to the last row. Half fisherman's rib or English rib I knit one row in fisherman's rib, then the next row, this one, I knit full needle rib, completely lowering the needles. With half fisherman's rib, you set the stitch size on one side slightly lower than the other. The handbook gives the details. Fair Isle. Fair Isle is a method of making a pattern by knitting selected needles with different colours or textures of yarn. Raise the needles on which you want to knit the first colour, lay the yarn across and through the yarn guides, knit until you reach a gap. Then pull afloat and continue with the next group. The float allows the fabric to expand when it is taken off the frame. Use the stitch size gauge to brush the float in and push it down the centre. Lay the yarn between the next two needles and that will lock it in round the next knitting. Raise the next needles to be knitted with another colour. Take the other yarn, and here I'm going to show you how to join a second colour into the knitting. Feed the yarn into the first needle, then pull it through until there is a short tail. Lay the tail across with the main yarn and knit it into the first couple of stitches to secure it. In fact, you're knitting this row in two parts with two colours, and I'll show you how it appears. There you are. Turn the frame round. Raise the needles to knit the first yarn again. You can probably just see how, because the red yarn was laid between two needles knitting the grey yarn, the red yarn has in fact caught, and I'll avoid a hole. Handbook gives more details. Now just tuck the yarn in, then raise the needles to knit the second yarn. See how the floats are going down inside the fabric. Lay the yarn across and once again start knitting. Pull the float, to secure the end of a yarn, cut the yarn and knit it into 2 or 3 stitches using a loose latch needle. Cut the yarn and now I pick up the yarn and pull it through the first stitch, cross over, put the needle through another stitch and pull the yarn through. That'll be enough to secure it, just tuck it in. Here's an example of some Fair Isle work. You will see the pattern is on both sides of the fabric and the floats are internal. Just have a closer look. Drop stitches. I'm sure you'll from time to time drop a stitch. Here I deliberately drop a stitch and knit the row. You can see the dropped stitch is obvious from the different appearance of the fabric at this point. Unravel the stitches by pulling the yarn up and sweeping it round behind the hook. This action lifts the stitch below and drops it back onto the hook.